Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Marisol Viña and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the California Endowment. It is my pleasure to welcome our TCE partners and staff to our first policy webinar of 2022, the California State Budget, Challenges and Opportunities to Advance Equity. As a reminder, these webinars are intended to be learning opportunities for our staff and partners to provide timely information about policy developments and processes that impact our state and our communities. Today's session is a collaboration with a longtime partner of the endowment and trusted experts when it comes to the state budget, none other than the California Budget and Policy Center. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the wonderful team at the center for your partnership in making today's event possible. As many of you know, the governor released his proposed budget on January 10th, which marked the start of the budget process. Deliberations, public hearings, and negotiations are taking place as we speak and will continue until all the parties reach a final budget by the constitutional deadline of June 15th. Although the last 2 years are an indication, budget season seems to be year-round these days, and more on that later. The state budget has a significant impact on our communities and our lives. And it's not only because of the dollars and the dollar allocations for the various public programs and systems, but also because of the policy implications of the decisions that are made through the budget process. Today's learning session will provide us some insight into what the process has been thus far since the budget was released, with a focus on where there may be opportunities and challenges to advance equity. And our presenters will also share some insights on what some of the conversations have been in the legislature around some key areas and what we can expect to see in the coming months. We will not cover everything in the next 60 minutes, but we will focus on some key issues, including health, education, homelessness, economic insecurity, and justice. And before I introduce our amazing lineup that we have for today, I want to note that these are informational, nonpartisan, non-lobbying learning sessions. Okay, so now I will briefly introduce our amazing presenters, but we will share their full bios in the post-webinar materials so you can all have them. So we are very lucky to have with us Chris Haney, the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center, who will start us off, and he will give us a big picture overview. And we will pause for questions after Chris's presentation. And then we will be joined by Adriana Ramos Yamamoto, Policy Analyst for Health and Behavioral Health at the California Budget and Policy Center, and Eric Salcedo, the State Policy Fellow for Education at the Center. And together with Chris, we'll share insights on the issue areas that I noted earlier. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so we encourage you to please enter your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many of them as possible at the end. Okay, so without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Marisol. It's wonderful to be with you all today. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the budget and for the ongoing partnership that we've had with the endowment over the many years that makes our work possible. So we're very grateful for that. I'm going to share with you a whole series of slides that we're going to have, and I'm sure these materials will be shared with you if they haven't already. And we're going to walk through the state budget and overview that Marisol just shared. We're going to start with some key context and then take some questions, and then we're going to dive into this and go issue by issue. So let's start with the next slide about some key context and just what the state of our state's economy looks like as we went into this budget season. And a few key points to make here are that the pandemic, as I think most of you know, has widened an already wide level of income inequality in the state. And the public supports, while they've helped avoid increases in poverty in California, the pandemic's still not over and continues to require some responses. And I'm just going to show you a few charts to give you a sense of this. So the next slide shows you what income inequality in the state looked like over the last couple of decades. And this is going up until just pre-onset of COVID-19, up until 2019. But you'll see even before then, in terms of incomes and how they changed over a couple of decade period, that only those at the very top, the top fifth and the top 1%, were seeing increases in their inflation-adjusted income over time. And this has been a long story in California, but we know that's probably gotten worse because in the midst of the pandemic, that top fifth and that top 1% have here again done very well. And many of the economic sectors and households that have been most harmed have been those in that bottom fifth and the second fifth and the middle fifth in particular. So we know widening income inequality continues to be a problem. Next slide. We also know that all of the work that the state and the federal government have done to try to respond to COVID-19 has had a positive impact in terms of helping avoid what it could have been some really substantial increases in the state's poverty rate. So using the supplemental poverty measure, a measure at the federal level that accounts for cost of living, we can see that California, without public supports in 2020, would have had a poverty rate of 27%, of over 27%, but that with all of the public supports that were provided, safety net services, unemployment insurance benefits, additional cash assistance, federal and state, that we saw the rate be down at 12%. And you can see a similar trend happened at the national level because of all of the federal aid. So we know that we've had a positive response in terms of the effects of public investments. And then the next slide just basically reinforces, however, that the pandemic isn't over. So when you look at how households are dealing with just meeting basic expenses, and you look at that by race and ethnicity, you see that in California in 2021, for Latinx, Black, and multi-race and other race households, that percentage who are struggling to make ends meet is much higher than the average and for other households and individuals in the state overall. So we know there are still budget responses that are needed. So that's kind of key context. Now, that's all stuff everybody is trying to deal with as we come into this year's budget process and the governor's proposal in January. And the key challenge state leaders are now dealing with is a budget paradox where the state is simultaneously taking in much more revenue than we had anticipated when the current year budget was enacted back in June. But the spending options are limited by some constitutional measures that restrict what state leaders can do with some of that funding. So I'm going to talk through some of that now, and then we'll take some questions before we go to the issue area stuff. So first thing to know on the revenue side is about all these unanticipated state revenues. And in January, the governor's proposal called for a $213 billion spending plan, or a $213 billion budget, in other words, that includes $29 billion in unanticipated revenues. So that's $29 billion over what had been projected from this last June. Essentially, this is what you're hearing called a surplus in the media. Since then, the State Legislative Analyst Office, which is sort of the budget office for the legislature, has projected that they think the state will take in even more than that, another $14 billion more than the governor projected. So if you're adding that up, that's over $40 billion more than they thought they would have. That could change going forward. What's happening in the Ukraine, what's happening with gas prices and inflation could affect the economy overall. But so far, the state is continuing to take in much more revenue than it thought, which is a good challenge to have because it gives state leaders options in terms of money they might be able to spend. The challenge that they're facing, and we'll go to the next slide here, is something called the state spending limit, or the GAGAN limit, as it's commonly known. It's a constitutional measure that goes back to 1979 that restricts state budget choices that are available even when the state's revenues are growing at a high level. And the way to understand how this spending cap works is that it draws a line. It essentially says that if state revenues over a 2-year period exceed this spending cap, which is set by a combination of factors, including population and inflation, that if we exceed the spending cap, not accounting for the things we can exclude, which I'll say more about in a second, that the funds, the excess revenues, have to be split equally between rebates to taxpayers and the other 50% going to schools and community colleges on a per pupil basis. So basically, if we go over the cap, the only options available to state leaders are rebates to taxpayers and money for schools. There are a whole array of excluded expenditures that are possible, most notably expenditures for emergencies, so what the state spends on the pandemic, does not count toward the limit. So that's somewhat helpful to state leaders. And then expenditures on infrastructure, which we're trying to figure out what the definitions are that count there. Does it include housing, for instance? So you could exclude infrastructure expenses as well. So that's the kind of window that the state leaders are dealing with in terms of this state spending limit. And we'll go to the next slide. The other challenge here is that this spending limit, or the GAN limit, is working at cross purposes with other constitutional requirements. So Proposition 98, which is the minimum funding guarantee for K through 12 and community colleges, and basically amounts to about 40% of the state budget going in any given year to K through 12 and community colleges, is interacting with this, as well as Proposition 2, which voters put in place in 2014, which creates a rainy day fund and requires that a percentage of the state's revenues go into this rainy day fund in any given year. So what's happening is these three constitutional requirements are resulting in a situation where every dollar in new revenue that the state takes in, it might have more than $1 in actual constitutional obligations that it has to meet, essentially kind of creating a debt to itself and making it more difficult for state leaders to allocate the surplus or the additional money that's coming in to things that we'd all like to see them invest in terms of helping Californians deal with the pandemic and deal with widening income inequality and some of the structural challenges that our state faces. So we'll go to the next slide in terms of how state leaders are dealing with this. As I said, there's a few things that they can do. They can do some spending on one-time spending like pandemic-related emergency expenditures, infrastructure expenditures. There's also a way that the state can reduce the amount of revenue that counts toward the limit by providing tax credits. So for example, you're probably hearing a lot of information about tax rebates in the news and different proposals from the governor and the state legislature. Those tax rebates could reduce the amount of state revenues that count to the limit and could be provided to households in some sort of way that tries to help low-income Californians or low and middle-income Californians, or whatever structure they end up deciding on. The big issue going forward out of all of this is that the cost of many of the services that are in the rest of the budget, all of the safety net services, healthcare, higher education, early care and education, all the other costs in the state budget, in many cases, the cost of those services will rise faster than the GAN limit might allow in terms of spending. And that's going to pinch or constrain what state leaders can do with funding going forward. So even if they manage to maneuver underneath the limit this year or around the limit in some fashion this year, this is going to be an issue that we're going to have to be dealing with over the next couple of years. The only way to reform the GAN limit is to do so via a ballot measure because it's a constitutional measure itself. So we would have to undo it or reform it through the ballot. And that's something that people are talking about more in the 2024 context than this year because we're already so far into 2022. So that's the paradox, all the revenues coming in, and then the restrictions the state leaders are facing. So even though we're in good times fiscally, there's some limitations that are making it harder for state leaders to make the decisions they'd like to make, making it harder for advocates to push for the things they'd like to see happen. So that's the overview and the kind of context. So before we go into some issue areas, we thought we should take some questions that people might have about this first kind of revenue and GAN limit side of things, in case that's not clear or people have other observations they wanted to make.
Thank you, Chris. That was very, very insightful. And the way you all described the GAN limit to some of us that are not in the weeds of a budget, it's just really, really clear as to how this could have implications on our safety net and social services. So thank you for sharing that. And it looks like we don't have any questions at the moment, but I'm sure they will come up. And please, as a reminder, everyone, feel free to put in your questions. So I know there's a lot more great content. So let's go ahead and jump right back in and bring in Adriana for her to walk us through some of the health pieces of the budget. Adriana.
Great. Thanks so much, Marisol. Yeah, as Marisol mentioned, I'm now going to go over some key health proposals in the governor's proposed budget at a pretty high level. And I'll also mention some relevant legislation. So if we could go back to the slides. Next slide. And then the next slide. Thank you. So starting with COVID-19 response, which as you all know, continues to be an ongoing issue for the state. The budget includes a total of $2.7 billion for COVID response. And of this amount, $1.2 billion is dedicated to improve the state's testing capacity. $583 million is dedicated to increase vaccination uptake. There's also $614 million in this package to support healthcare systems and frontline workers who have been, as you all know, very much burdened by this ongoing pandemic. There's also $200 million to enhance the state's emergency response and public health capacities, $74 million to support services for newly arrived migrants and border communities. There's also $36 million to expand statewide contact tracing. And a lot of experts predict that COVID-19 will eventually become endemic. I'm sure you all have been reading and hearing about this in the news. And so in order to reach that next phase, infections would essentially have to stabilize, meaning there wouldn't be any rampant upticks or outbreaks. And the administration recently announced a preparedness plan called SMARTER, which includes stockpiling masks and tests. Next slide, please. So moving on to public health, the budget includes much needed public health investments, specifically $235.2 million for disease surveillance and readiness and maintenance of IT operations at the state level. There's also $200 million ongoing for public health infrastructure at the local level and $100 million annually for public health infrastructure at the state level. Also included is $55 million for opioid overdose prevention and surveillance, as well as $50 million ongoing to increase funding for home visiting, with the goal of doubling the number of children and families who receive services through the California Home Visiting Program or the Black Infant Health Program. And this commitment is a critical first step in reversing the chronic underfunding of public health systems that led to so many Californians, and particularly communities of color, experiencing higher rates of illness and death due to historic and ongoing structural racism, which continues to have a profound impact on the health and well-being of many communities across the state. And the governor's administration and other state leaders can employ a variety of strategies to address these root causes of health inequities. And one of these strategies that advocates have been pushing for is a budget ask to establish dedicated funding to support community-based organizations, clinics, and tribal organizations in their efforts to advance health equity in their community. And this budget ask is called the Health Equity and Racial Justice Fund. So I wanted to mention that. And before I move on, I also want to mention that we have an upcoming publication specifically looking at public health spending in the state. So please stay tuned for that. Next slide, please. The budget proposal also includes other notable investments in health. First of all, it expands Medi-Cal to all income-eligible Californians between the ages of 26 to 49, regardless of immigration status. This is the last group excluded from comprehensive health coverage due to racist, xenophobic federal policies. Also included is a reduction in premiums that many Californians pay for Medi-Cal coverage. These are Medi-Cal enrollees whose incomes are marginally above the cutoff for no-cost Medi-Cal and therefore must pay a monthly premium. Around 500,000 enrollees would have their premiums reduced under this proposal. And a few bills that I want to quickly mention here, also relevant to this, is AB 1995, which would eliminate Medi-Cal premiums completely, as well as AB 1900, which would make the share of cost program more affordable for older Californians and Californians with disabilities. So both of these bills have been moving forward in the legislature, so definitely look out for those. And as you all know, the administration is moving forward with implementing the ambitious Medi-Cal reform effort known as CalAIM, with the goal of better supporting millions of Californians enrolled in Medi-Cal, particularly those experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, children with complex medical conditions, children and youth in foster care, Californians involved with the justice system, and older adults who often have to navigate multiple complex delivery systems in order to receive health-related services. And lastly, I want to mention the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Initiative, which aims to transform California's behavioral health system for all children and youth in California. And about $1.2 billion is included in this year's budget for this initiative. Next slide, please. And so before we pause for Q&A and handing it over to Eric, I want to briefly mention some key homelessness proposals. So next slide, please. So the state budget included approximately $12 billion to address homelessness over the current and upcoming fiscal years. The governor's current budget proposal adds another $2 billion over 2 years. And these new proposals focus on 2 areas listed here. So specifically, $500 million one-time general fund to address homeless encampments, specifically for jurisdictions to invest in short and long-term rehousing strategies for people experiencing homelessness in encampments. More details about allowed uses of these funds will be important for understanding whether these efforts would effectively and respectfully address the housing and support services needed for Californians living in encampments. It also includes $1.5 billion general fund over 2 years for immediate housing and treatment services for unhoused individuals with serious behavioral health issues. And I also want to mention that the governor also announced a care court proposal to create a court-ordered service and housing plans for individuals with a severe mental illness or substance abuse disorder who do not have the medical decision-making capacity. And next slide, please. I believe now we're going to be pausing for Q&A.
Actually, we're gonna keep going and turn it over to Eric.
Oh, apologies.
Thanks, Adriana and Marisol. Hey, everyone. My name is Eric Salcedo. Let's dive right into education. We know that the pandemic raised even more barriers for students already barred from opportunity. So in contrast to last year, the majority of proposed spending for K12 education is ongoing, and there aren't as many new proposals compared to last year again. But the proposed budget follows through on commitments to programs that were established last year. And I'll be highlighting a few of those proposals, including in expanded learning, increased funding for the state's funding formula, and also touching a little bit on school nutrition and other missed opportunities that we wanted to comment on. So I will be starting with expanded learning. The 2021 Budget Act created the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program that provides grants to school districts and charter schools so they can offer additional hours of learning outside the regular school day, including summer. Through these programs, students can have access to additional academic supports and enrichment activities that are needed to re-engage students to school and also to accelerate learning. Funding for these programs are allocated to districts through a funding formula that provides funding amounts based on the district's number of students who are English learners and from families with low incomes in grades TK through 6. The 2022-23 budget proposes an increase of $3.4 billion for this program to make modifications to the funding structure, including lowering the thresholds that provides higher per student funding, and also increasing that per student funding. The budget proposal also delays the program's requirements until 23-24, and districts that do not meet those requirements will not lose all of their funding, as it was the case in the original program. And those changes provide some support since districts are facing challenges with expanding programs, partly due to workforce shortages, And if those shortages continue, it's going to be increasingly difficult to scale up these programs as intended. Next slide, please. The governor's budget increases funding for the state's K12 education funding formula, also known as the Local Control Funding Formula, or the LCFF, by approximately $3.3 billion. The proposal would provide $2.1 billion to fund a 5.33% cost of living adjustment, or COLA, for the LCFF. And the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office, estimates that this percentage for the COLA is likely to be higher. And we'll know once the federal government publishes updates in late April. In addition to the cost of living adjustment, because many school districts are experiencing reductions in average daily attendance, or ADA, which is the average number of students in class each day throughout the year, the LCFF, and those LCFF grants are calculated based on ADA, or average daily attendance. The governor is proposing making a change to the funding formula to soften the fiscal impacts of declining enrollment on school districts. And the administration is estimating about $1.2 million in ongoing costs to make this change. There's urgency in addressing this issue because the hold harmless provisions that provided funding protections for school districts with declining ADA will expire later this year. Other relevant legislation around this issue is AB 860, which would essentially base funding on enrollment rather than ADA. There's a lot of conversation, as Marisol mentioned at the beginning, on many issues, including this one. And there are this proposal, for example, it's being analyzed by different organizations. There's a lot of research out there right now showing a little bit more about the differences between ADA funding versus enrollment funding. And I can share more if someone has questions around that. Next slide, please. And lastly, the budget proposal provides more than $1 billion to expand school nutrition programs. Starting in 22-23, all California public schools will be required to provide two meals per day to any student, regardless of income. And the governor's proposal provides $596 million to fund this requirement. The proposal also includes $450 million in one-time funding over 3 years for kitchen infrastructure and equipment, which, by the way, is excluded from the GAGAN limit that Chris talked about earlier. And in addition to that, there's $30 million in one-time non-Prop 98, general fund dollars over 2 years to expand farm-to-school demonstration projects. And next slide, please. And lastly, we wanted to comment a little bit more on some missed opportunities and some key considerations. One of the missed opportunities is supporting English learners. The governor has advanced major education proposals, expanded learning, community schools, among others, but we haven't seen the same commitment to improving education for English learners or prioritizing bilingual education. The proposal does include an investment of $200 million for multilingual libraries, yet the administration lacks a bold policy agenda that leverages multilingual students' assets and skills. Another issue is the deepening of teacher shortages. The pandemic has impacted teacher shortages due to increased teacher retirements and resignations, the creation of additional positions, and a limited supply of candidates. So now there's increased urgency for the state to focus more on recruiting and preparing more candidates, retaining new teachers, and also improving teacher conditions. And lastly, just wanted to comment on the GAGAN limit and what that means for K12 14 education. Chris mentioned earlier that if we hit the cap and we go over the limit, the legislature has two different options, and we wanted to emphasize that in case we go over the limit, that those payments to K-14 education would not be allocated equitably because they would go out on a per student basis rather than to the funding formula, which is an equity-based formula. Next slide, please. And just to close, I wanted to just quickly comment on some of the early care and education proposals included in the budget. The governor's proposal would make some changes to the California State's peer school program. Some of the changes would be ensuring that at least 10% of children in their care have a disability, and also requires additional supportive services for children who are dual language learners. The proposal would also change eligibility rules so that providers can also enroll 2-year-olds if all their other children are served. And finally, the budget proposal includes $500 million in one-time Prop 98 funds for the Inclusive Early Education Expansion Program to build or modify facilities. On the next slide is that the 22-23 will be the year 2 of Universal Transitional Kindergarten and its implementation. And the proposed budget includes a little over $1 billion to continue to expand TK to younger children and also add more staff to TK classroom to reduce the teacher to student ratios. And lastly, on subsidized childcare, on the next slide, the governor's proposal includes funding for additional childcare spaces and for support programs and data systems. The budget proposal doesn't continue any of the pandemic supports offered to families and providers, such as stipends, grade supplements, hold harmless provisions, non-operational days, or waiving family fees. And I'll pass it back to Chris.
Thanks, Eric. So we also wanted to just touch upon some key proposals that are out there to boost economic security more generally, recognizing that providing healthcare, preschool, childcare, homelessness services are also ways that we boost economic security, but in the sense of traditional human service and safety net programs, cash assistance proposals, there are a number of proposals that are in the governor's plan from January, and then there's some legislative responses to those proposals or some legislative proposals so far. So we'll go to the next slide and I'll walk through some of those quickly. The first one is that the governor didn't have anything in his proposal that was a significant expansion of the state's earned income tax credit or the young child tax credit. These are two what we call refundable tax credits that provide direct cash assistance to families through the tax code who have incomes, in this case, that are below $30,000 or the essentially full-time minimum wage. And if you don't owe money to the federal government or the state government via the tax system, you receive it back in the form of cash assistance. So it's a way of providing direct cash. The California EITC Coalition, a set of other coalitions, and a legislative sponsor are calling for expanding the young child tax credit, which is a $1,000 credit that goes to families who have kids under the age of 6 by ending work requirements. So right now you have to make at least $1 of income a year in order to qualify. And the coalition and the sponsors are asking for that income or work requirement to be removed so that caregivers could qualify for the tax credit, and those families would receive that $1,000 as well, recognizing that caregiving is something we want them to be able to do and is a valuable contribution, just like work, to the state's overall health. And then temporarily expanding that young child tax credit to families with children 17 and under. So the federal child tax credit is for folks 17 and families 17 and under, and this would then mimic the federal credit more generally. It's listed here as temporarily because the coalition and the sponsor feel like the governor and the legislature probably won't go for an ongoing expansion up to the age of 7 or for 17 and under. So if we could temporarily do it, we might then have a chance of making it ongoing in future years. We're also calling for increasing the minimum California EITC credit, which primarily would benefit adults who don't have children. So right now, those individuals are only receiving about $200 a year from the California EITC, and they're excluded from a lot of other human services and safety net benefits for various reasons. And so providing them with a larger credit would particularly help individuals who don't have children, many of whom work in sectors that have been dramatically impacted by the pandemic. There's a call for increasing CalWORKs grants above and beyond what the governor is proposing and removing some work-related barriers and administrative burdens there. So very similar to the sort of strategy with the EITC. And then the governor does have a couple of new proposals. One is a new tax credit for former foster youth. So former foster youth, once they reach the age of 18, would receive an EITC-like credit that would provide them with some cash assistance, recognizing that oftentimes former foster youth face economic challenges, particularly in those early years of being adults. And then the governor also calls for a significant expansion of child savings accounts, something that's often called baby bonds in other sectors. The state put a program in place in the last couple of years, and the governor's expansion would significantly move that up on a one-time basis, and then likely would create opportunities for more ongoing investments in child savings accounts as a way to produce wealth for lower income children over time. So that's an array of family economic security supports. Lastly, I just want to touch on, we'll go to the next slide, on justice system proposals, because I know many of you at the endowment do work in the justice system space. There isn't as much to say in the governor's proposals, but in the corrections arena, a couple of things I would note is the governor doesn't propose any additional prison closures. Governor's proposals or the actual budget enacted over the last couple of years called for closing 2 prisons. Legislative Analyst Office has said the state could close up to 5 over the next few years, and the governor hasn't proposed any further closures. There is some funding in the state budget to increase support for substance abuse treatment for people in the correction system, to provide more higher education services in partnership with the CSU system, and to provide more funding for homelessness prevention for those individuals who are exiting the system and re-entering the community. So there is some funding in those kinds of spaces. In the juvenile arena, the governor's budget basically continues a commitment from earlier years to eliminate the state's housing juveniles in the state correction system, so they would no longer be wards of the state, and transferring the responsibility for working with youth to counties. The funding increases that are in the governor's budget are only for county facilities, and that's one of the challenges that advocates and others are trying to address, which is a lot of the supports for youth with this juvenile justice transition are happening through work with community-based organizations and not necessarily through the county facilities. And in many instances, the counties aren't well equipped to do that kind of work. And so there's a lot of CBO support needed, but the state isn't putting funding into supporting those CBOs or requiring that the counties share the funding with CBOs. So there's work to be done there from an advocacy perspective. We're also very concerned at the Budget Center that there's an array of other proposals in the governor's budget that are focused on crime reduction and have really significant equity concerns attached to them. So there's some funding in the governor's budget in the justice system arena that's talking about focusing on addressing retail crime because of all of the attention to retail issues in the state. But there'd be a negative impact, particularly for communities of color, if there's a crackdown on trying to provide stiffer sentences, for instance, to people who are then encounter the justice system in some sort of way. There'd be equity implications of that. The governor's proposal on homelessness to address encampments would negatively potentially incarcerate or create problems for homeless people who are going to be more likely to be people of color. And so some of the crackdown on some of these things has real equity implications that we think need to be addressed as the legislature combats or puts their own proposals forward in response to the governor. Last thing I just wanted to touch upon are where some of the risks and opportunities lie, and that'll be on the next slide, which is things to just know that are happening at the same time. So a lot of the pandemic supports, particularly at the federal level, are lapsing, have already lapsed, or may lapse. If you follow in the news, you may have heard that by the end of March, the access to the rental assistance program that the federal government has provided and that the state's helping administer will lapse, which means that if people don't have their application for rental assistance in place by the end of March, they won't be eligible to receive that assistance. And there's still more funding available there. And so state leaders could take some action to extend that deadline or to provide more legal protection so that landlords aren't able to start evicting people who didn't receive that assistance or who can't receive that assistance after March 31st. So we've got issues like that that need to be dealt with. There are still funding levels that are not addressed that are systemically underfunded public supports. So Adriana does a lot of work covering public health. We have chronically underfunded public health coming into the pandemic. We're obviously spending a lot more now, but that whole system needs additional funding on a more permanent and ongoing basis. Very much the same kind of system problems with early care and learning from the pre-K, TK, and childcare perspective, where we need significant expansion over time of those systems in order to serve the eligible children and their families. There are also state policymakers have big decisions to make on how to meet the state's ongoing and unmet needs while dealing with these constitutional requirements. So what I was talking about with the GAN limit, the combination of the GAN limits, interaction with Prop 98 and with Prop 2 in terms of K12 funding and rainy day funds, those requirements are going to keep constraining options available to state leaders in future years if we don't find a way to make some changes. And then last thing I would just say is that there are election year shifts that are happening that are threatening to reverse some of the gains that our states made in recent decades. You can see this, I think, most vividly in some of the proposals and some of the rhetoric that's out there around criminal justice reform, where our states made some significant advances in recent years to reduce sentences, reduce incarceration levels. And there's a lot of attention either because of the pandemic or concerns about crime or because of election year shifts and people wanting to appear to be tougher on crime during these periods. There's a lot of threats to those kinds of advances that are emerging because of just the challenges of election year politics. And so we're going to have to keep our eyes on that in terms of a risk that needs to be given some attention and to watch what comes out of legislative proposals. So those are key risks and opportunities. I'm happy to take questions here. I'm sure Eric and Adriana will join as needed as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris, Adriana, and Eric, for that great overview of not just the various issue areas, but how these issues are being considered by the legislature and what may be coming up in the months ahead. So we do have a series of questions, and so we're going to bring Adriana and Eric back to join Chris for some questions that we have from the audience that we would like to get to. And so the first one, Chris, I'm hoping that you can respond to. This is related to the GAN limit, and it is a question by Michael Tora, and it's here on the screen. On the GAN limit of the 50% of excess revenues that needs to be returned to taxpayers, do the governor and legislature have the discretion to direct those dollars to lower income taxpayers?
Yes, they do. There is not specific language that tells the governor and the legislature how they have to deliver the tax rebates. So there is discretion, we believe, for the governor and the legislature to target those tax rebates or those tax credits to people in whatever way they ultimately can agree on as a way to do that. We have been making the case at the Budget Center that should very much look like the Golden State stimulus payments that the governor and the legislature agreed to in the current fiscal year that capped the income level at $75,000 and provided a larger credit for low-income households and provided, in addition, a larger credit for Californians who are undocumented, who are restricted from receiving the federal aid. Those kind of proposals are not what we're hearing come from the legislature or the governor so far, so we're concerned about how they might target things. There's been a couple different proposals from the legislature. One of them has proposed just a flat rate for everyone, so including millionaires, billionaires, those in that top 1%. We don't think that's a very good idea. It would not use the state's resources very widely, and it would mean that the credit would be very low because you're diluting how far the available funding can go. The legislative leadership have come out with their own proposal for a flat rate credit, but it would but it would be targeted to those making less than $250,000 a year. We're glad to see that it's targeted, but we think $250,000 is way too high. The Golden State stimulus only went up to $75,000. We know the legislature and the governor are trying to push this further up into the moderate income level, but $250,000 is basically 90% of the state's population, and we think there's a lot of folks at that upper income level who have the ability to weather increases in prices, whether that's gas or inflation or otherwise, in ways that other low-income households can't. So yeah, they have the discretion. I think it's a question of what it looks like, and we're waiting this week to see what the governor is going to come out with in terms of his proposals.
Great. Thank you, Chris. The next question comes from Malachi, and it's regarding cannabis. I know this is not an area that the center covers fully, but I wonder if there's something that Adriana may want to say on this piece.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, as Marisol mentioned, we don't really cover cannabis at the Budget Center, but what I will say, which speaks to part of this question, the racial equity perspective, as many of you know, the war on drugs really purposefully harmed communities of colors for decades. And reform efforts, not just in California, but across other states, have really aimed to correct some of that harm and really rehabilitate and empower communities who have been impacted by this racist institution. So to build on the efforts in California to support successful and safe operations of cannabis businesses in our state, the budget includes $13.6 million cannabis tax fund for this fiscal year to fund proposals for the Department of Cannabis Control. So specifically around creating a unified licensing system, creating a data warehouse, and launching a consumer education and awareness campaign. The budget also updates the allocation of the cannabis tax fund, which, as you all know, is created by Prop 64. So once all of the priorities under Prop 64 have been met, the remaining funds are then allocated to youth education, prevention, early intervention and treatment, environmental protection, and public safety related measures. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question, but please feel free to connect with me and I can make sure that your questions are answered.
Great. Thank you so much, Adriana. Okay, so then we have a number of questions on education. So Eric, let's start with a couple of them. So one is, I don't know if you have recommendations on the best way to track the amount of funds that go to school districts. It's a question from Kevin.
Yeah, and I assume that question is related to expanded learning. I don't have a specific recommendation of where, but I can speak a little bit more about, and I can look and get back to Kevin on that question if needed. But I can speak about the sort of like the funding structure of the program for school districts that are over in this proposal, districts that have a student population that is either English learner or low income, and they have more than 80%, their per student funding rate in 22-23 under the proposal would be $2,500.
Okay. And so then staying on the expanded learning, I think the raised questions pertain to the expanded learning. So if the school districts receive additional funds for the 22-23 school year, and they do not use the funding intended for students, will they be or not penalized for the following year?
Exactly. That's my understanding, that the audit requirements would be in place until beginning in 23-24.
Okay. Okay, and then he follows up by saying, will unused funds remain restricted to the students that need it most, or will districts have the flexibility to take those remaining funds for other purposes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm not sure about the answer for this one, but I can definitely get back to Ray on this one. But my understanding is that districts are required to offer expanded learning to at least 50% of the students who are English learners or low-income students first, and then they can be then service can be extended to other students. But I do not think that the unused funds can go back to general purposes. But I can double check on that.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Okay, so the next question pertains to young adults that are coming out of juvenile detention, prisons, etc., back into our communities. So, Adriana, are you aware of any economic opportunities or any proposals pertaining to this issue?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ray, for raising this important issue. I can't necessarily speak to the economic opportunities for youth and young adults that are returning home. I believe our colleagues at the Budget Center, specifically Scott Graves and Monica Davalos, who cover justice and our team, may be able to answer more fully. So please connect with me. I do know that in the proposed budget, there is funding for a program called the Returning Home Well program to provide emergency housing services to adults who are at risk of being unhoused when they leave prison. So this program was specifically created in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and would continue for another 3 years at a cost of specifically $10.6 million general fund annually. And these resources would essentially support the continuation of this program while also providing the opportunity to assess ongoing needs for the release of this population, according to the governor's budget summary. So you can find more details about that specific program in our first look overview of the proposed budget. And yeah, again, please follow up with me so that I can connect you with our colleagues who know a lot more about this important issue than I can speak to at the moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Adriana. And we will go ahead and put a link in the chat to the first look analysis that the center prepared. It's a really great source of information. I go to it all the time. So we're gonna provide that link in the chat for everyone. And thank you everyone so much for the great questions. We do have the contact information of the staff at the center, as Adriana mentioned, and they appreciate you all welcoming the follow-ups. And the information, the contact information is on the slide deck that we will share with everyone. So just great appreciations for your time, for this great, very informative webinar. I think that we have covered all of the questions that we have from our audience today. And just know that we will continue to be tracking as developments unfold, and really look to you as, you know, great experts in the budget and all of the issue areas that impact our communities. And so we're gonna now hoping that we can have everyone take a quick survey. We do want to hear from you. We want to hear what you thought of today's event, and then any additional events that you would like for our public affairs team to host in the future. So we do have a QR code that's up on the screen. We will also be sharing the link to the survey in a follow-up email that everyone will receive. And we really welcome your feedback. So you can go ahead and scan the code from your phone and fill the survey out right now. If you can, we would greatly appreciate it. And also we will follow up with the survey. And once again, just want to thank Chris, Adriana, and Eric for joining us today and for really providing us this great overview on where the opportunities might be, where the challenges are, where those missed opportunities also, are flagged. And again, we will share all the resources with everyone. We want to thank you for joining us, and we hope that we will see you at our next event. Thank you so much. This concludes our program.